who have joined us today, panelists and participants, and all my colleagues who have supported us in the process of setting this up. My name is Naresh Singh, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality, and Public Policy at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at O.P.JGU Global University in Haryana, India. Let us start by having some welcoming opening remarks from our Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy, Professor Sudarshan. Professor Sudarshan.
Thank you, Naresh. I'm really very thrilled and happy because I think this is a very unusual webinar. We are all getting webinar weary for various reasons, and we need this particular one to give us all some spiritual upliftment and sustenance. I'm very happy that we managed to set up in the School of Government and Public Policy the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality, and Public Policy. Now, it's a kind of a admixture of things. Somebody wouldn't normally wake up in the morning and think of complexity economics on the one hand and applied spirituality as the next thing. But there's a kind of a logic to this, in that Naresh has been instrumental in making some key connections with scholars and connecting with my colleague Sudeep Patra in the university to conceive of a center of this kind. And I think it's very timely and important because I've been educated in economics. Rajiv knows, Delhi School of Economics, the usual things, and the whole discipline is being interrogated now as to whether its fundamental assumptions and premises are valid, whether it's actually helping what the early classical economists wanted the discipline to do, which was to advance human welfare. So in that context, there's been a lot of interest in ideas that come from physics. Economics has always been sort of teased as having physics envy, and there's been a great connection between the top physicists and economists in a way. In India, it's Professor Mahalanobis who started the Planning Commission. So these new ideas in physics have, and in quantum physics have opened up a whole field. But then along with it comes a great interest in themes like consciousness and spirituality. Because once you get into the realm of physics and you think of Einstein, you then, there is a natural affinity. I mean, Einstein did say that God, may be subtle, but he's never mean. I mean, he kind of anticipated that there would be a kind of a harmony in the universe, that the laws of physics, lawful harmony is what he thought of. And then you get into the field of quantum physics with a whole lot of uncertainties. But what that emphasizes is that these are ideas that we have to grapple with. And I think that we are in a state in the world where we really do need this. I mean, there is so much of this religious fundamentalism, religious dogma, religion taking over, and people losing a sense of what how human beings connect to nature, what might be, spirituality in a way, which is not religion, which is not following religious doctrines and rituals and beliefs, but is something beyond that. So, and in a sense, when we were setting up the center, we had Naresh had the opportunity to meet Swami Agnivesh, who passed away recently, and he's visited our university and given some talks. And Swami Agnivesh, although he wore saffron and was formally a member of the Arya Samaj, was an iconoclast individual, an activist. And for him, what mattered was to have, to question all dogmas, that it's important to doubt, not take anything as given, not follow any authority. And, Rajiv would know, that's a very fundamental idea in Buddhism, not to take anybody and their word as authority, but to question and experience oneself. So he emphasized doubt, debate, and dissent. And if you look at the way, quantum physics has evolved, the debates and the dialogues between the great physicists, Schrödinger, Niels Bohr, Einstein, Bose in Calcutta, we sense this, why it's important to have doubt, debate, and dissenting views, and a quest for something that, is going to, serve the human species, but not just the human species, but all living things on earth and everything that you might think of as having been created by some divinity, the whole universe. So yatha andanda, yatha pindanda kind of idea. So I think, therefore, it's not all that bizarre that we have a center with the title Complexity Economics and Applied Spirituality. There is a certain sense to this. And so we want to, and then the other thing, important thing is to not to have these disciplinary boundaries and silos and define ourselves as economists, physicists, political scientists, this, that, and the other, and then not see things in the wholeness in which we ought to be trying to see things. And so it's been an exciting thing. We've had a few of these Zoom colloquia. We inaugurated it, and we had another one on, applied, quantum mechanics to social science. And this is our third meeting. And at the end of all of these dialogues, I think we'll have a better idea as to what paths to pursue. And I'm very, very grateful that all of you have assembled and joined us. We were hoping that we'd have, in all of these things, in our culture, we'd like to have some evolved person, give us a blessing. We were hoping that we could have the Dalai Lama do that, but he's otherwise engaged. So we're very grateful that Rajiv Mehrotra, who works with the Foundation for Universal Responsibility that His Holiness founded, is with us, and we have other panelists equally capable of providing us insights and guiding us. And there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm in the student community. I must say, young people are in a way worried and questioning, what's happening to them, what's the way of the world, where are they going? And I think it's important to open up a new field instead of these, the beaten track and the conventional disciplines and, graduating and so on, that we regard higher education as an opportunity to actually, open young people's minds in a quest and benefit from what the teachers, all of you in the panel, for instance, today, have to tell us. It was Newton who remarked that even a dwarf standing on the shoulders of the great and the tall will see much further. It's in that spirit that we welcome all the panelists in our session. You are the giants on the shoulders of whom a whole generation of young people can stand and see further. And so in that spirit, I welcome you all, and I'd also thank Naresh and Anirban and Sudeep Patra and my colleague Debajit for thinking of a unusual center of this kind and beginning these dialogues and conversations for our benefit, of course, but also mindful that we are a university and we have a lot of young people, and they need to break away from the frustrating rote learning and and learn and understand that coming to a university is, the purpose of it is to get educated, not to get certified with a degree. Unfortunately now, people pay high fees in Ivy League universities because of the brand and the certificate, and one doesn't know what is it that they actually learn. And in our university, we'd like to emphasize that it's not, we are a young university, we are not Ivy League, we are not all of that kind, but I think we'd like to emphasize that our students must learn and learn, differently, because in a way, the conventional forms of education have been killing, have truncated curiosity and a sense of adventure and discovery, which we'd like to stimulate in young people. So that's the reason why we have this center, and I'm very grateful to all of you who've come together to participate in it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dean Sudarshan. So we have 5 panelists, and each panelist will do about 10 minutes opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion. Before I get into the panelists, let me just share a few quick contextual remarks about the overall work that we are planning to do. So at the center, as the Dean explained, we have 3 streams of work. One is on complexity economics, or more broadly, complexity sciences, quantum social science, and applied spirituality, all asking the question, what value can we add to public policy? How can we influence the way public policy makers behave, but as well, the process of public policy and the public policy themselves and their outcomes. We could have made this name of this center quite simple and said science, spirituality, and applied and public policy. But then science might also include all the old stuff. And we are talking about contemporary or the newer sciences of complexity and quantum social science. And that's why we have this rather involved name, as the Dean was explaining. Swami Agnivesh, to whom the Dean referred, has been an inspiration to us. Swami Agnivesh, for those of you who don't know, was a very interesting person in his life and his work. He was a lawyer, a college professor, a state minister of education, a monk, and a social activist. And he was the head of the Arya Samaj movement and the Arya Samaj religion in a way, but I believe they will prefer to call it a social movement more than a religion. He was the head of the global Arya Samaj. And let me just to give you a quick insight into his thinking. In one of his last interviews with Soumya Shankar, published in a newspaper called The Caravan, just before his death, The title of the interview is headed, Organized Religion Makes Slaves of Men. Very interesting. And then it goes on to say, in all these religions, however, the core values are universal, which we call spiritual core values: love, truth, justice, compassion, and I might add emancipatory, as distinct from the slave implication of the mind of religion. Spirituality, by definition, he goes on to say, is subversive because it is the driving force against the status quo. All the prophets were spiritual. Their teachings, however, were converted into rituals by their followers. And let me move into the other side of our work at the center to quote from Professor Claire Brown, who is professor of economics at UC, University of California in Berkeley. In her recent book, well, not that recent, 2017 book called Buddhist Economics. And she says free market economics is not guiding us toward living meaningful lives in a healthy world, nor is it offering solutions to our concerns about global wars, income inequality, and environmental threats. Buddhist economics, in contrast, provides guidance for restructuring both our individual lives and the economy to create a better world. Practice compassion to be happy replaces more is better. Everyone's well-being is connected replaces maximize your own position. The welfare of humans and nature are interdependent replaces pollution is a social cost that the individual can ignore. She goes on to quote the Dalai Lama as telling us that the feeling of not having enough and wanting more does not arise from the inherent desirability of the objects we are seeking, but from our own mental illusions. Just to put it in context, so the panelists then have been asked to talk about their work relevant to applying spirituality to public policy. They will seek to address the opportunities and constraints that we will face in seeking to apply universal spiritual understandings and values to public policy. I should let the panelists and our audience know that, out of this conversation and other work that we are doing, we are hoping that we will establish a master's degree in applied spirituality for public policy later on. So we will be listening very carefully to the conversation. This understanding the universal teachings of spirituality incorporates the illusion of the egoic self, the false sense of separateness from each other and from nature, as well as the shared cosmic consciousness, the love shared by all. So the panelists will seek to answer two simple questions which I have posed to them, which are, how can universal spiritual values such as compassion, authenticity, truth, integrity, love, etc., which are all embedded in spirituality, how can these guide public policy, both the process and the public policy makers themselves? And the other question, what might a university teaching and research agenda look like? How might we use these ideas? So with those comments, let me ask the participants to suggest your ideas as well as any questions you might have in the chat box. We hope to have ample time for discussion. We will have to ask the panelists to limit their opening remarks to 10 minutes, summarize their key ideas, and then we will move to the discussion. Let me now introduce our panelists one by one as they speak, and I will do it in the way the flyer was designed with their bios, which you have. We will start with Swami Vivekananda, who is the minister and spiritual leader of the Vedanta Society of New York since January 6, 2017. He is also a inaugural fellow for 2019-2020 at the Harvard Divinity School. So I wouldn't go through his entire bio, which is on the flyer. Swamiji, thank you for joining us, and I turn it over to you. Please
Namaskar.
go ahead.
Namaskar. Thank you, Professor Naresh Singh ji. Thank you, Dean Sudarshan ji, and the other organizers for inviting me to this panel. I convey my namaskars to the other distinguished panelists and the guests. The topic itself, applied spirituality and public policy, it reminded me of Mahatma Gandhi, who was accused of mixing religion and politics. And Mahatma Gandhi reputedly replied that the two greatest forces for human good that I know are religion and politics. So as long as I live, I shall not stop doing religion in politics and politics in religion. This is a vision that is actually shared by many of the great leaders of pre-independence India. If you see, it's not just Mahatma Gandhi. If you see, Rabindranath Tagore, you see Aurobindo, if you see Subhash Chandra Bose, all of them were deeply spiritual people, and they infused their leadership with their vision of spirituality. And all of them, one thing they had in common was that they were all inspired by, they drew great inspiration from Swami Vivekananda, which brings me to what I am doing here, the work that I'm doing. Swami Vivekananda came to this country, United States, in 1893 to attend the World Parliament of Religions, representing Hinduism. And he basically, he is at the source of this whole stream of gurus and yogis and lamas and spiritual teachers bringing the spiritual heritage of the East to the West. So Swami Vivekananda sort of inaugurated that entire process, which is still continuing. And he went back to India and he became, in the words of an eminent historian, the unconscious father of Indian nationalism. So generations of Indian nationalists after him, freedom fighters, they drew their inspiration from Swami Vivekananda. One of the things that he did when he was here in the United States in his very short life, in the few years that he was here in the United States, he established this Vedanta Society of New York in 1894, where I am at present. So I and my brother monks, we are just carrying forward the work of Swami Vivekananda. So that's what does it consist in, and what are the basic ideas, the fundamental ideas? As Professor Naresh Singh ji said, I will just outline them in the next few minutes. Swami Vivekananda had the same view that spirituality and our life in the world, he said that the fictitious difference between religion and the life in the world must disappear. The distinction that we tend to draw between spirituality and public policy in our present language, between spirituality and our life in the world, that distinction is harmful for both. For spirituality itself, if there's a competition for resources, for your time and energy, between your spiritual practices, set it aside from the rest of your life, you will find that the demands of life, of family, of your job, of your doing the taxes or whatever it is, or the pandemic, they are so much that they will push your time and energy for meditation. We will continuously have the complaint that we have no time for meditation, we have no energy left over for spiritual practices. And similarly, if you divorce spirituality from life, what happens is life becomes meaningless. Life becomes, after all, a fruitless material struggle. So infusing our life with spirituality, that is a principle of that comes from Vedanta, which is the philosophy which Swami Vivekananda brought to the United States, brought to the world stage. The key ideas of Vedanta are only two. Again, I'm using Swami Vivekananda's language. The two ideas, fundamental ideas. One is the divinity within us, the divinity within the human being, And the second one is the oneness of the universe, oneness of all existence. So these two ideas, our inherent divinity and the oneness of all existence. By inherent divinity, what I mean is that we are not just material beings, beings of flesh and blood. We are not even just emotional beings, not even just intellectual beings, not even just moral beings. Deeper than our physical dimension, our intellectual dimension, moral, emotional dimensions, is the spiritual dimension. What is the spiritual dimension? In Vedanta, we get a very clear answer to this. But as we investigate, as we inquire into our existence, we start with the physical body, and then we notice that inwards and subtler than this is our pranic body. Inwards and subtler than that is our mental body, thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas. And that's where most people stop. Most of us think of ourselves as minds embodied. So minds in a physical body. That's what we mostly think about ourselves. But Vedanta pushes deeper. It asks the question, are we not aware of our own thoughts and feelings? And we are. When you are happy, who else is aware that you are happy other than yourself? When we are unhappy, we are aware that we are unhappy. It's an experience. So that which is experiencing the mind, that cannot be the mind itself. That's a crucial insight. That which is experiencing the mind cannot be the mind itself. There is something deeper than the mind. And that deeper dimension is, you can call it awareness, consciousness. In Vedanta, there are numerous words: Chaitanya, Chit, Samvit, Turiya. All the processes of Vedanta, which is based on the Upanishads, goes back more than 5,000 years. It outlines very, very impersonal, very precise philosophical tools for introspection, which, for example, the Panchakosha Viveka, the 5 layers of the human personality, or the Drigdrishya Viveka, the analysis of the seer and the seen, or the Avasthatraya Vichara, that means the analysis of the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. By the way, all of these are now coming to notice in the booming field of consciousness studies. That's another thing that I'm doing here, is tracking the developments in consciousness studies in the West. And I'm in touch with some of the leading figures in this field. So like David Chalmers and others. So I just keep track of what's going on and see how we are coming to the very core of our existence. That what are we as conscious beings? So that's one discovery, one fundamental discovery, that ultimately we are not just physical beings or even mental beings, that we are beings of pure awareness. And as you explore that pure awareness, you begin to see, Vedanta shows you, it's not a product of the physical body. It's not a byproduct of the brain. It is more fundamental than our physical nature, more fundamental than our mental nature also. So this awareness, this unchanging, pure subject awareness, this is what Swami Vivekananda meant by the divinity within each of us. This is what religions call spirit within each of us. And it's not yet scientifically accepted, certainly not accepted by mainstream science. We still have a long distance to go. But the newfound interest in consciousness studies gives me a lot of hope that we are moving in the right direction. The second big discovery in Vedanta, which Swami Vivekananda stressed, was that this consciousness, which you find within yourself, what is its relationship with everything else, with other beings? Are there many consciousnesses? What about the material universe? Is it something separate from consciousness? So to cut it short, that what they found in Vedanta was that there is only one fundamental reality. That there is one consciousness, which is our own consciousness, which appears as this entire universe. The one appearing as the many. You and the universe are not separate. You are one with the entire universe, or rather more precisely, the universe is one with you. This was the great Vedantic dictum, Tat Tvamasi, that thou art. It was a central idea. From this comes very interesting implications. One is Swami Vivekananda drew the message of strength, that if you are not material beings, then if you are spiritual beings, then strength is a natural outcome. Mental strength and emotional strength and ethical strength, moral strength, all of that flows from this idea of the divinity within, the idea of oneness of existence. The idea of the harmony of religions was another central teaching of Swami Vivekananda. So you understand different religions as true and valid, not as the same. Many people accuse us of saying that, oh, you're saying all religions are the same. No, we are not saying that. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna was very particular that the religions are different, in fact. They are different, they are valuable, they are unique, but they are also paths to spirituality. They are all paths to spiritual realization. So this idea, it was implicit in Hinduism for thousands of years. It's always been there. It just made more explicit by Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So this is the basic idea, the divinity within us and the oneness of all existence. Now, what about its relation to public policy? The two questions which have been asked, I just say a couple of sentences about each of these questions and stop. Relation to public policy. I was just thinking, here, when I look at New York here, and I'm thinking, what are we aiming for in India, Mumbai and Delhi and Calcutta? It seems to be sort of unconsciously, we're trying to be a poor imitation of New York or San Francisco. Would that solve our problems? No, obviously not. If Mahatma Gandhi saw this a long time ago, he was asked, why are you so against industrialization? Don't you want your country to have the same level of living as at the United Kingdom in those days? And he said it required Great Britain to conquer half the world, to exploit half the world, to enjoy that kind of living standard. And imagine how many worlds it would take for India to have that kind of consumerism. So that is not the solution. Suppose you did achieve it. Suppose you did achieve it. You made the great cities of India into second-rate copies of the great metropolises of the West. Would that solve your problem? Even after achieving it, are people happy and satisfied here? Let me tell you, no. It is not. If you pursue that, either you will not achieve it and you'll be frustrated, or worse, you will achieve it and we have a deeper, more subtle level of frustration that life becomes meaningless and loneliness, meaninglessness of life. This becomes the great, haunting problem of prosperity. So this is one thing. It'll lead to frustration if unless spirituality is infused into public policy, it leads to a kind of deep frustration, personal level and at the community level too. We can talk more about that later. Last, about the university. I am reminded of the University Education Commission. Dr. Radhakrishnan was the head of that in 1948. And there he made a plea for spiritual education. In those more innocent times, he was very clear, moral and religious education. He used the word religious education. And he said it does not violate the spirit of the Indian Constitution. You can study religion without preaching religion, without teaching religion. And he went forward and he said, you can actually teach religion also within the provisions of the Indian Constitution, as long as you take the impersonal, highest ideals of different religions and you teach it to people. He even gave a syllabus, first year, second year, third year in college, what you need to teach. All of that was, of course, ignored. I understand in the new education policy, this idea has been taken up in India that the spiritual goal of life is being emphasized in education. All right, I'll leave it there, 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Naresh Singh, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Swamiji. Absolutely delightful. And thanks also for staying on time. And next, we'll have Rabbi Michael Lerner. Rabbi Michael Lerner is an American political activist. He's a rabbi as well, a psychotherapist, spiritual teacher, innovator, and the editor of Tikkun, a progressive Jewish interfaith magazine based in Berkeley, California. I have followed Rabbi Lerner's work for 3 decades or so. The first book I read on the politics of meaning. And most recently, I was delighted at this last book, or his recent book called Revolutionary Love. So it's a great pleasure and honor to have Rabbi Michael Lerner with us. And Rabbi, I turn it over to you now. You have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And signal to me when that 10 minutes is up, okay?
Will do.
So I want to say that totally love that first presentation, and also what you said, and what you're all about. It sounds fantastic and wonderful. So I'm going to jump in from a totally different angle, okay? Because like everything that was just said about Hinduism, I could translate it into Hebrew terms and say, here, we also have it. You know, we also go in the same direction. We also seek that unity of all being. So what I want to do is give a more specific approach that might possibly be something of use in your university and in your program that you're. And it goes like this. The economics that we know, and actually not just economics, but the ethos of the dominant ethos of capitalist societies all over the world. And at this point, I can't say I know of any society in this world that isn't shaped by the ethos of capitalism. Is what we call the bottom line. The bottom line of when we look at and try to describe any economic policy, any political policy, our cultural life, etc. We see them as efficient, rational, and productive to the extent that they maximize money and power for somebody. And usually an elite, but nevertheless, that vision of efficiency, rationality, and productivity is measured by the extent to which somebody or some group of people have maximized money and power. We at tikkun, and tikkun is a Hebrew word that means to heal and repair and transform the world. So we at tikkun, and tikkun is just a manifestation of the ethos of Judaism, say that we need a new bottom line. The new bottom line says the following: we want to judge every institution, every corporation, our economic system as a whole, our judicial system, our healthcare system, our education system, to be efficient, rational, and productive to the extent that they maximize people's capacities to be loving and caring, kind and generous, socially and economically focused on social and economic justice, capable of invested in trying to protect the planet Earth and from all of the ways in which it's being destroyed, capable of looking at other human beings, not from the standpoint of what can they do to maximize my well-being, my personal well-being, but instead to seeing every human being as an embodiment of the sacred and looking at the Earth as a whole and the universe beyond it, not simply from the standpoint as we do today of, I wonder if there's something here I can turn into a commodity and sell, but rather looking at the universe and the planet with awe and wonder and radical amazement at the grandeur and mystery of life. That's our new bottom line, okay? So we believe that one of the most important things that one could do today in this actual historical circumstance that we're in is to convince people and institutions to adopt this new bottom line. And in fact, to make it the core of the policies of government and of every other institution in the society, and to challenge every institution. We know what your bottom line is. We want you to change it, and to build mass movements of people who will be out there finding ways to challenge the old bottom line and to substitute this new bottom line. Now, I want to give you a few examples of what that might look like in concrete, in terms of policy. A new bottom line would lead to something that we've called the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment to the US Constitution. But not every country has a constitution, and certainly not everyone has one as difficult to change as our Constitution. But anyway, this is a plan for a new, for a transformation, or at least an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that I think could be useful in, to other countries. And it goes like this. The Environmental Social and Social Responsibility Amendment has several planks. Plank number one is that we want to eliminate all money from politics, except money that is given equally to all candidates, so that money and given equally by the government, so that money is no longer a determining factor of who's successful and who's not successful in politics, but all other money is forbidden. All personal money, all sources of money from either corporations or nonprofits or whatever, out of politics. And so that's number one part of the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment. The second part goes like this. We want every corporation with incomes above what we'll say $50 million a year. Every corporate, so we're not talking about the little mom and pop corporations, but we're talking about the large corporations that actually shape the world, not just in the United States, but the United States and other Western countries have corporations that shape many of the other societies in the world. Every corporation has to get a new corporate charter once every 5 years. And that new charter will only be granted to those corporations that can prove a satisfactory history of environmental and social responsibility to a jury of ordinary citizens. Why a jury of ordinary citizens? Because we know, we've seen in the United States that when you set up bodies that official government bodies that have the task of supervising and making them ethically responsible various elements of our society, it turns out that the very groups that they're supposed to be, that the people who are put onto those commissions are often in the pockets of, or hoping to get into the pockets of, the very corporations that they're supposed to supervise. Or so we are going to trust ordinary human beings. However, those human beings will be aided by those people who are experts in or can represent the interests of other countries and who are able to give guidance to the jury of ordinary citizens. But and if the corporation can't prove a satisfactory history of environmental and social responsibility to this jury, which incidentally will receive testimony, not just from people in the United States, but from all over the globe, because corporations have these global impacts. And very often right now, they're dumping stuff in the weaker or less powerful countries that can't protect their own citizens from the impact of corporate greed. So that's a second part, that if the jury can't find that it has a satisfactory history of social and environmental history in the last 5 years that it's judging, that it will put them on either on probation for a few years to make rectifications, or simply take away their corporate charter. And since corporations really need a corporate charter in order to function, that's the third part is that it will require that.
Can you conclude in a minute?
Okay, I'm gone already. All right, then I'll just say one other part about this. It also, as a concrete, includes a global Marshall Plan, a plan to eliminate global poverty, homelessness, and hunger in order to make it no longer necessary for people to be on boats to getting to the richer countries of the world, including the United States, and desperately leaving the places that they are. So, we need to equalize global wealth, and in such a way that all countries in the world can adequately take care of their own citizens. Okay, so these are all concretes of a way to talk about a new bottom line of love, kindness, and generosity, awe and wonder at the grandeur of the universe, and recognizing every human being as embodiment of the sacred. And this is a concrete vision of what it would look like. Now, just one last sentence and I'll stop. What can your students do? They can, the big question that they need to research is, what can we do to change people's attitudes so that they don't say, oh, this is impossible, and you can never create a world like this. But instead, we are to learn how to be not realistic, because being realistic in our world means accepting the dimensions of social policy that have been shaped by the people who have the disproportionate amount of wealth and power. And they're always telling you that fundamental transformation is impossible. And so your students need to learn what are the ways to overcome people's desire to be realistic and to recognize that the only way that this planet can be saved from environmental destruction, and that our human relationships can be saved from craziness between people, is to overcome the ethos of selfishness with the ethos of love, kindness, and generosity. And that is a concrete task for research in your university.
Rabbi, thank you so very much. I have heard many radical thoughts in my life and uttered a few myself. Today I learned a new one, and that is how to be unrealistic. All we always hear about this being realistic in this world, and that's not taking us any place. So Rabbi, thanks. Just as I expected, very provocative and very concrete and practical as well. It is now my great pleasure to ask our friend and colleague, Rajiv Mehrotra. Rajiv is an Indian writer, television producer, director, documentary filmmaker, a personal student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is the honorary managing trustee of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility established with the Nobel Peace Prize. So Rajiv, it's such an honor to have you with us, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Naresh Bhai, my old friend Sudarshan from university. What a wonderful, distinguished panel. And I am, as Naresh Bhai just said, I'm just a student of a great master, and I've been deeply privileged. And just to share with you that my own sort of roots and heritage, spiritual heritage, started really with the Ramakrishna mission and Swami Ranganathananda, from whom I was deeply privileged and blessed.
Am I audible?
Diksha. Yes, you are, ma'am. You need to put off your microphone, though. From whom I received Diksha, and one of the great sort of joys and honors and blessings of my life. And that's what I really want to talk about, is that Swami Ranganathananda and then my now sort of root guru, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, became good friends. And herein lies a very powerful and important lesson, I believe, for our times. And what is the sort of the great one of the greatest challenges that we confront today is that we live in a deeply divided and fragmented world. And the lessons from both these traditions and Swami Vivekananda, pointed to, and I would really like to elaborate on that, if I may. And His Holiness has often said, wouldn't it be wonderful if all religions and traditions would encourage us to learn from them and then leave them alone? And so you have this. Well, let me start with the Ramakrishna mission, though it has already been very eloquently represented and the Vedanta tradition by Swamiji. And my own sort of interest in the Ramakrishna mission was really in Thakur, as people in Bengal call Sri Ramakrishna. And it was in Ramakrishna's extremely well documented sadhanas, his journey, his spiritual quest. And there was a message in the fact that this was documented by Sri M. Because here was a great sort of avatar, an embodiment of God. And what did he do? He demonstrated that he too, in public, went through the practices, the sadhanas of his tradition in order to reinforce, to demonstrate the importance of sadhana and training. So we have this sort of, how do I put it, this sort of illusion of the sort of a magical moment of illumination and everything falls and you see light and thunder or whatever that flash moment of enlightenment is. And so here was an avatar who goes through these practices and techniques of the diversity of Hinduism first, the Dvaita, Advaita, Tantra, the whole gamut of it. And what does he do at the end of this? He goes out and he builds a little cottage, a kutir, on the precincts outside the Dakhineshwar temple. And he engages in the life of Islam and Christianity. And he embraces all traditions and learns from them without compromising his essential practice, sadhana, embodiment of bhakti. And this was sort of, in a sense, codified in a formal manner by Swami Vivekananda. And what does Swami Vivekananda do? He helps us understand, and this is where it has so much value, and I think universities miss this element of the quest and learning and teaching. So what does he do? He codifies the aspirant or the sadhaka, not just of spirituality, but of life, of universal values, of training and education, into 4 archetypes. And we know them as the 4 yogas. The dharma yoga, the karma yoga, the man of action who learns and then transforms through action, bhakti through devotion, raj yoga through practice, and so forth. So he demonstrated that the sadhana and practice was necessary in the spiritual quest, and B, that there were these archetypes and combinations of these. And one of the remarkable things that happens in the Ramakrishna mission is that young monks are identified by these broad archetypes, and then sort of the karma yogi sorts are sent off to the Naxalbari, and they run schools in areas where terrorists infest themselves. The bhaktas do bhakti in the temple. And so, when we're looking for lessons for a university, I think the first thing we need to, recognize is the different mental dispositions of each one of our students. And I mean, we cannot have a sort of a universal, kind of approach to this. And His Holiness, acknowledged this on the centenary celebration of Swami Vivekananda at the Ramakrishna Mission in Delhi. And he said, I learned so much from Swami Vivekananda. And it is this principle of celebrating diversity that is at the core of our ability to deal with our fragmented planet. And what does it do? It enabled Sri Ramakrishna to practice not just the diversity of his tradition, but it enabled the Dalai Lama to go to a mosque and perform the namaz with a skull cap on. It enables him to go to a synagogue. It enables him to go to a church and sing Christian hymns with a cross strung around his neck. And so it is that experiential transformation that our approaches to education in a university need to follow. And what is the status, what is the mindset of students in our contemporary universities? I think we need to use their vocabulary and their referencing of contemporary challenges and predicaments and the contemporary vocabulary that they engage in. And so it's not something our foundation is involved with, because we ran against huge obstacles in India when we attempted to do this. And that was, His Holiness had said that, look, we must look at developing and training the mind, which is the great legacy of India's civilizational heritage. And only the other day I heard Swami Vivekananda, and I will just encapsulate. And he went into the detail of how the Vedanta teaches us how to listen, how it teaches us to process knowledge, which means that when we listen, we nurture knowledge, and then we move to processing the knowledge to understanding, and then he said, and then meditation or reflection, so that this knowledge begins to impact our deepest reflexive responses. It impacts who we are, and we are not merely operating at the level of, let me use the word wisdom, something that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition uses. And so the genius of our civilization is to combine method and wisdom. So it is not merely enough for us to transmit wisdom unless we simultaneously engage in cultivating the methods that will transform wisdom into realization. So we can listen to the seminar, we can listen to a lecture, we can listen to a talk, we can be reasoned and logicked, but we will not be transformed in ways that, we talk about universal values. I mean, how do you teach universal values? You can teach them as knowledge. And so we need to approach it through both methodologies. And let me give you an example that, we are working.
If you can wrap up in a minute or so for us.
Okay, I will just finish this and then and talk about compassion and why that is so important. Because working with they were both students at Harvard University, Daniel Goleman and Richie Davidson, so who's now at Wisconsin University, and they found through psychological testing that people who were under stress or who had mental problems tended to use the word I, me, mine a lot. And so we know from our traditions that it is the obsession with the self. So you use the research, the empirical research of modern psychology, and then you start looking at the methods by which you cultivate compassion. And what does that do? You explain it in a vocabulary that people will understand and say, when you practice compassion and you think of other people, the sense of the self that suffers diminishes. So, and I'm going to take one valuable minute of yours, because I think this is sort of the icing on the cake, perhaps. And then you find that when people meditate on compassion, the neuroplasticity of the brain establishes that there are changes in the parts of the brain which manifest happiness or contentment. So you create a framework which is based on empirical logic and understanding, which explains traditional wisdom. And one of the methods, and that's where I will stop, is you use the logic of interdependence and say how we live in an interdependent world. And so if I begin to recognize that my happiness depends on the happiness of others, and I engage in practices that deepen the experience of that, I am more likely to be transformed into manifesting compassion. And so we have launched through Emory University a program which is called Social, Ethical, and Emotional Learning, with a whole curriculum from class 1 to 12 that is independent of any religion or spirituality, that use these techniques and ideas such as this to nurture a change in values. Thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded my brief.
No, that's excellent. Rajiv, thank you so much. I like your closing with the work on cell, the social, emotional learning.
And ethical learning.
Yeah, interesting indeed. I'm engaged in a little bit of work on that myself, but we'll talk offline on that. Thanks again, Rajiv Ji, for excellent insights. It's my pleasure now to ask our panelists, Reverend Dr. Joni Carley. Joni and I as well go back quite a ways now after, in fact, we connected through a common friend and colleague from the Santa Fe Institute. And many of you would know that the Santa Fe Institute has been one of the leading lights in the field of complexity theory and complexity economics. Reverend Dr. Joni Carley is the author of The Alchemy of Power, The Invisible Factors of Leadership. She speaks and consults with business and nonprofit leaders and does work at the United Nations on values-driven leadership, etc. Joni, it's my great pleasure to ask you now to speak. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here among such amazing minds. Thank you for inviting me. My work includes serving on the UN Committee of Religious NGOs. I vice chair the Cluster for Global Citizenship at the UN, and I sit on United Religions Initiative UN Circle. But most of my work there now is through a group called UN 2020, whose name is going to morph. And there I provide thought leadership on values-driven cultural development, specifically as it applies to United Nations reform. So I'm also an interspiritual minister and a lifelong student of indigenous, religious, and spiritual wisdom. And I've trekked the world to discover that essential teachings are congruent among almost all spiritual paths. And many of our common spiritual truths are captured in secular documents like the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration and Program of Action on Culture of Peace, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And these documents are known as first principles documents. And they echo the profound and the critical spiritual wisdom we need to create our highest good right now. But still, there's a really serious disconnect because very wise indigenous leaders are usually at the UN to receive funding and services. And religious leaders are most often there in their capacity as service providers. And really good and really important work gets done under those auspices, which is fine. But what gets lost is the ageless and substantive wisdom that we need to create our greatest good. We don't have a mechanism to bring forward those deeper spiritual understandings into processes, policies, and procedures. And in fact, there's some prejudices that specifically cut them out. And so I so appreciate Jindal Global University's work toward applied spirituality, because that is exactly what's missing. The world needs a way to access and apply this deeper wisdom and higher consciousness that's revealed by our spiritual pursuits. We need high-level decision-making tables to include spiritual voices on their own terms, not just as social service and relief funders and receivers. We need them there as experts on the metaphysical intelligence we need to be actually able to put first principles first. So in terms of opportunities, given that COVID leaves us no choice but to reinvent our so-called normal, and given that our normal was never going to be a long-term survival plan, it's time to seize this moment and go all out for our highest vision of a just, a compassionate, a happy, and a well humanity living on a thriving planet. There's never been a time like this to stake our claim to a world that's spelled out in our religious and our spiritual teachings, and that's codified in our first principles documents. The opportunity of this unique moment in history is that we have the unprecedented capacity, we have the resources, we have the connectivity, and my goodness, we certainly have the urgency to stake claim to a reality that reflects our highest callings and our highest knowings. Just like every crisis of injustice is first and foremost a crisis of consciousness, having the world we all want to live in entails recognizing the role of consciousness in developing the policies and the practices of a peaceful world. Consciousness is causal of results. It comes first. And we could say that spirituality is even more primal than consciousness, yet both are disregarded as kind of inconsequential, fluffy stuff. And getting into constraints, what I like to call the fluffy myth, I think, is one of our biggest constraints. The fluffy myth, which I go into a lot in my book, The Alchemy of Power, is the fictitious belief that intangibles like consciousness and spirituality are inconsequential, fluffy stuff. And there's just absolutely no evidence to substantiate that myth. In fact, the primacy of intangibles like values and morality has been demonstrated by metaphysicians. It's been unpacked by sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, and spiritual leaders throughout all of time. And it's been confirmed by a plethora of international values and leadership studies across all sectors over decades. Still though, fluff mythology continues to lead us to believe that metaphysical phenomena have no basis in reality, but the data is clear. When metaphysical factors like consciousness and culture are accounted for and intentionally developed, almost all social and economic indicators go up. So this gets back to the conversation about reality. Fluff mythology conveys the belief that power comes with tangibles like tanks, while it's dismissive of the far more formidable yet intangible power of our consciousness. Consciousness is determinative, it's causal, yet we don't account for it as the major player it is in human outcomes. And the word consciousness has spiritual implications, and so it's often considered controversial. And that's how fluff mythology constrains our thinking. It leads us to believe that our egoic identities are all that's real, and to ignore the reality of our spiritual beingness. And I'm not really a believer in making the egoic self wrong. Our egos are just a natural part of the human condition. You know, the deal is we're probably all gonna have egos until at least the day we die. My dear friend Ashok Gangadine says, our spiritual journeys take us from the ego pillar to the Buddha fly. So from the caterpillar who has to exist for us to have a butterfly, we need the limitations of our ego's desires, of our ego's mistakes and problems to push us forward until the winds of divinity pull us into higher realms of consciousness. During its metamorphosis, every single cell of the caterpillar changes. Not one cell stays the same. It's not just transformation, it's transfiguration. From the humble caterpillar to the majesty of the butterfly. And that's really what's going on the planet now. We have to move beyond even the idea, we have to move beyond change, move beyond transformation to transfiguration. And it's a metaphor for our spiritual journeys. There's usually a dark night of the soul when we need to fall apart completely to be able to do greater good. In fact, there's a section of my book I call Go Ahead, Fall Apart. And our social and our economic policies have inherent expectations that everybody's going to emerge in beautiful flying colors without giving any regard for the transformative work of spiritual development. And one of the reasons we end up feeling so trapped in the egoic parts of ourselves is that we don't place systemic valuation on the unfoldment of our more enlightened selves. In other words, we live in egoic economic and social structures that categorically ignore and devalue what it takes to transcend our egoic trappings. Egoic-based economics is a good way to describe what we're transitioning away from as we begin to imagine the paradigm shift that we seem to be moving through. The United Nations General Assembly voted unanimously in 2012 to start convening toward a new economic paradigm based on happiness and well-being. But even decades before that, there was an ever-growing international call for putting first principles first, what Rabbi Lerner referred to as a new bottom line. There's an increasingly coherent mandate and an ever-growing call for values-driven global governance. Our current economic valuations prioritize things like weapons, stock profits, and debt-based options. But the things that people actually value are more like connectedness, truth, happiness. In order to transition to what I'm calling a first principles first paradigm, we have to place more accurate valuations on the intangibles that are most valuable to us, starting with placing higher economic and social valuations on our spiritual lives. It's time for our policies to reflect more accurate valuation for our values. Our spirituality supports our values development and vice versa. When we develop our values, we create space for our spirits. Values are the bridge between the intangible and the tangible. They connect what goes on in our consciousness with what we make real on the ground. Values development is cultural development because values are the building blocks of culture. And the best way for values to guide public policy is to measure them and account for them and develop them consciously. For that, I have used Barrett cultural transformation tools. I think they're a profound contribution to humanity. They're in data-based, values-driven tools that have been used by thousands of organizations and NGOs, private, public sector worldwide. They're used at the country level by 27 nations so far, and they account for culture by quantifying values. Values accountability is what's going to allow us to overcome and at the same time embrace the subjectivity of our spirituality and the differences in our religions. Values accountability supports our transcendence of our egoic limitations. Values accountability gives us a way to integrate our spiritual lives with our cultural lives because it allows us to clearly measure and manage the things that spirituality reveals. Values development gives us access to metaphysics, which is the realm of causality. The realm of the invisible factors that make our lives so rich is metaphysics, and we have to give it its place at the table. Consciously developing our values gives us a clear and proven means to transcend our false sense of separateness with each other and from nature. So what might a university teaching and research agenda look like? Well, to me, basics include values, ethics, mysticism, world religions, indigenous wisdom, and first principles documents. It also means we have to move away from focusing on fixes and rather focus on systemic transformation. We have to move away from egoic systems of separation and toward policies that reflect the reality that we are all global citizens who are interdependently co-arising with everyone and everything else and with the planet itself. And it has to include an exploration of values-driven, partnership-based, all-win-oriented systems like donut economics and things like that. There's plenty going on out there to pull from. A good curriculum also has to make space for love and for joy. It's got to create frameworks for dialogues of love instead of dialogues of enmity. Applied spirituality is an absolutely brilliant framework for this. And at the same time, it also has to make space for dark nights of the soul when we can truly fall apart. I believe too that there has to be a lot of creativity for creativity's sake in a good curriculum. Matthew Fox did a lot of work on this in creation spirituality. So there should be credits for creative classes just for the expression of creativity. I also believe there has to be required credits in metaphysics, including training in alchemy. And alchemy is the art and the science of applying metaphysical principles to produce more than the sum of parts in labor. Because nothing less than alchemy is necessary to transform our current situation into a common good-centered world. Another piece of advice I would give in creating programs is be bold and be bodacious. Take risks, explore the depths of our consciousness, go deeper than we think should be realistic or allowable. Matthew Fox says the prophets say no and the mystics say yes. And so any good curriculum has to give a lot of experiential exploration for the mystical yeses and the prophetic no's to emerge and to be empowered. I also believe it has to focus on Sustainable Development Goal 17, partnership, and on the interstices. I'm going to hold this up because these are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and between the blocks of color, you'll see white spaces. And I believe that's where our work is as a spiritual, where does spirituality impact? In the white spaces, in the interstices. And we've got to open up some space there to look at those metaphysical factors that are behind the scenes. We need to provide policymakers the time and the space to develop themselves spiritually. And so I believe that there ought to be required meditation time, and that meditation time should increase with every year of schooling. The higher the level of schooling, the more meditation time is required. Because bringing spirituality and policy together requires a kind of discernment that can only come through direct spiritual experience. And it's really easy for people to get information on policy. It's a lot harder to bring forward spirituality. So we have to give greater weight to that kind of development if we're going to get the spiritual discernment necessary for breakthrough policies. So in conclusion, the most important... Yeah, the most important job of an applied spirituality program is to support that spiritual spark that's unique in each of us and that's common to all of us, to nurture that mysterious spark that can never be extinguished and that always seeks to burn brighter. So the most important work would be to stoke the fires of love, the most powerful force on the planet. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joni. And with all those very practical suggestions about how we might move forward, I'm starting to think that the ideas we are getting are really going to help us with this master's program in applied spirituality and public policy as we proceed. And now I have the great pleasure of asking Dr. Mahmoud Maseli, who is a Canadian-Iranian political philosopher, ethicist, spiritualist, poet, and a global think tank leader. Mahmoud's area of research concentration includes global ethics, ethics of global development, human rights, global justice, etc. Mahmoud, it's my great pleasure to ask you now to address us. Thank you.
Hello all, good morning from Ottawa. Also, I have to say that perhaps good evening in India to our friends that are in India. My name is Mahmoud Masali. It's a great pleasure for me to be invited to this seminar. I would like to extend my thanks to the organizer of the seminar for providing this opportunity to share some ideas about the topic of spirituality and public policy. When he called me and asked me to somehow give a kind of presentation in this seminar, the idea that came to my mind right away was, okay, why should we discuss a relationship between spirituality and public policy? Why? What is the reason for this? Because these are seemingly two contradictory maybe domains or realms. So why we have to define, or why it is important to define a kind of maybe relationship between these two domains. Indeed, the idea came to my own mind almost in 2002 when a new think tank was created called Alternative Perspectives and Global Concepts. So we have been concentrated on the ethical and spiritual aspects of the global life from 2002. And recently, in March, facing corona condition, the same question came to our mind. Accordingly, we have initiated, right now we are organizing weekly run international seminars about the spirituality and politics. This coming Friday, we'll have the 26th international seminar about the topic. So I want to go back again to the same question, why it is important to discuss spirituality and public policy. It's a very important question. It's a timely question and it's very, very challenging question. When we look at the question again and the two real, we can see that these are contradictory. So why we have to discuss it? Imagine again, when you think about the spirituality refers to, spirituality is a sphere of beautifulness of human soul. But public policy and politics are the realm of power. So the public policy and politics are the realm of domination and extending of certain kind of hegemonic, maybe control over the mind of people, while the spirituality is a domain of human values, truth, compassion, and love, etc., etc. So again, the question is, okay, why we have to discuss a kind of link between these two contradictory domains? When we look at that, the question carefully, I would like to say that some of the perhaps great Sufi thinkers from my own background have answered the question about why we should discuss these two together, politics and spirituality. I would like to draw on Rumi, Muhammad Jalaluddin Mawlavi, the Persian mystical poet of almost 13th century, as far as I remember, who said that the reason for raising the importance of the link or the importance of spirituality for politics is that we have lost control of our own life. So we are confused as to who we are, where we are living, where we want to go. The response to the question of one of his disciples who asked from Rumi, okay, what is the meaning of the poison? Rumi said, the poison means whatever thing that is not necessary for us or is more than necessary for us. It could be power, it could be wealth, it could be hunger, it could be ego, it could be laziness, it could be love, ambition, hate, or anything else. That brings me, that brilliant idea from Rumi brings me to the answer to the question. We must think about the importance of spirituality and the spiritual life in politics and public policy because of the fact that we must create certain kind of balance and harmony in the modern life. So, but what happened in the modern life that I believe a kind of imbalance was created between the spiritual world and the modern politics or the modern public policy. Let's go back and look at very short look at the history of the emergence of politics or public policy. So we go back. In its modern sense of the term, public policy or the conception of public policy is a product of the modern time as a kind of response to the vacuum that was created by the collapse of the world of sacred, the end of the Middle Ages. So as a result of the collapse of the world of sacred, and as a result of the destroying of the hierarchical social relations coming from the feudal system of the time, a kind of gap was created. So the question at that time raised by almost all scholars of the modern time was that, okay, how to help people to live together peacefully in a kind of social relations. So when we look at the works of almost all famous scholars, such as, for example, Hobbes, such as Locke, such as perhaps Rousseau or Kant, or even contemporary John Rawls, we can see that all of them have been trying to argue that, okay, that should be a kind of new perspective that can take care of the society and the life of people. All of these scholars argue that in order to somehow support people, citizens in the modern life and the time of the vacuum that was created at that time, the society must become a secular society. So politics and religion must be separated from each other as long as all of us we know. For example, when we look at, for example, let's say John Locke. When I was teaching this topic in the winter at the University of Ottawa, it came to my mind to raise to the question for my students, okay, why spirituality is important and why it has been separated, has been perhaps abstracted from politics. John Locke, in one of his famous articles called, as you all perhaps you know, A Letter Concerning Toleration, argues that spirituality or the spiritual realm and politics are two different entities. They are two different spheres. They are two different realms. Because of the fact that the job of the politics or public policy is to protect people, to address the needs of people in the real world, in the mundane world. But the mission of spirituality is to work on the soul of people, for the salvation, to help people to understand who they are, to try to find a meaningful life for themselves beyond the superficiality of the conception of the modern life in their own, let's say, existence and so on. John Locke, and when we look at the rest of the Western liberal thinkers, they all argue that secularism or the separation of spiritual world or religious world from politics is required if you want to have a good, prosperous, healthy, and let's say organized society. So we must think about how via this kind of separation, we can create a new order to the life of people. Here is that I believe that spirituality was separated from politics or from public policy, or I say that spirituality was separated from the public sphere. So the public sphere became the domain of the activities and the views and the consent of citizens who wanted to control their own life and all aspects of their own life. And in this regard, the idea was created from the very beginning of the modern time that religion or spirituality should not have any place at all in politics. So why this kind of discussion of separation of spirituality from politics was discussed by the thinkers? Why almost all of the thinkers of the modern time, from I would say from the beginning of 16th century, even until present time, they believe that spirituality and public policy, which is a kind of maybe set of rules and principles for regulation of society, why these two should be separated. What is the reason for that? The answer is quite easy. Almost all scholars, when we delve deep into the works of all philosophers and thinkers, we can read from the work of all of them that religion should be away from politics, or spirituality should not have any place in politics because of the fact that these are the irrational things, because they cannot be proved. So the real life or the political life, in the modern sense of that, is the realm of people, let's say, people's experience and experiment and so on. So we should say no to spirituality because of the fact that we are aware of the truth that in the pre-modern era, spirituality and religion were imposing to people certain kind of religious conformity. And that was a process of enslaving or the capturing the mind of people. So we have to say no to them. So religion and spirituality should go. If you say to spirituality that you should not have any kind of place in today's life, that prepares the road for, let's say, organizing and constructing of a new life in which people can enjoy their own freedom, they can enjoy their own equality, etc., etc. So religion or spirituality should not have any place in the life of people. Here is that we can see that modern politics or modern public policy themselves, they carry the kind of very powerful promise for human emancipation. People must be liberated, must be freed from religious conformity, from the ascribed status and the other, let's say, hierarchical social relations. So all people must be freed from that. In order to free people from all those evils or devils in the life of people, we must invest in the secular mind. So what is secular mind? Separation of religion or spirituality from politics. And that was amazing. That was highly promising. And perhaps even in today's world, most of the people, most of the scholars would like to welcome this idea, separation of spirituality from politics. However, and so sad, this kind of emancipatory, if I can say, slogan or promise collapse into the vortex of perhaps the total denial of the spiritual dimension of the life of people. What happened is that right after the, perhaps I can say, the emergence of the new life, of the new world, and exclusion of spirituality, the spiritual voice from the life of people, what happened was that human society started experiencing a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And I want to say that by separation of spirituality from the public life or from the public sphere, that was the greatest mission or perhaps promise of the modern time. What happened out of this was that people lost their own meaning of life. So people were suffering from a lot of different types of perhaps suffering and the issues in their own life.
Mahmoud, can you conclude in about a minute?
So, sure, okay. So, but I want to say that this issue or this situation has been somehow terminated as a result of the condition of globality. As we can see, a new atmosphere has created for the voice of spirituality to somehow enter or somehow be involved in the political life. And here is what I want to say, that just very quickly, because I should not talk a lot. Here is that the spiritual world became a powerful, maybe, voice, a powerful call in the life of people. We can look at some of the examples, lots of examples about the voice of spirituality in today's world. For example, Vahavta, perhaps Rabbi can correct me, that was a kind of Canadian NGO that is acting based on Tikkun Olam, or for example, we got Canadian Catholic for Peace, or for example, Sufi Ruhaniya International, or Dance of Universal Peace, and so on. These are all perhaps the representatives of the voice of spirituality who are trying to somehow argue that we are in need of the return of the spiritual voice in today's life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud, for showing us how these two got separated, and then at the end, the efforts being made to bring them back and the reasons why. So we had a few questions in the chat box, but we have been running out of time. So in order to conclude, I want to do two things. I'd like to ask all our participants and our panelists to give us just 10 minutes more, and we will conclude. I hope that's okay. And in order to conclude this way, I just wanted to go back to the panelists. Now that you have heard each other, if you wanted to make just a 1-minute comment on any issues that now come to your mind, on the broad issues, and focus them on, you know, what a university could address. You have started doing that already, but might I go around in the same order in which the panelists presented, and just in a minute, a closing remark, and then we will say thanks and wrap this up. We have been recording this, and I hope all of you are comfortable with that. We had sent out a message asking your permission in the chat box. Of course, I know people were busy listening. So I hope that all are comfortable with that, so that when we post it, you know, people will be able, and you will be able to also review these ideas. So let me start the way we started. So Swamiji, would you want to just say in a minute any closing thoughts?
Yes, and thank you to the panelists for the wonderful points that you have made. I'm just reminded of a parable that Sri Ramakrishna used to say is, you know, that no matter how many zeros you line up, it's still zero. But if you put a 1 before the zeros, all the zeros have value. Now that's so insightful, and that's, I think, one thing that we have all been trying to say here is that spirituality is that one. If you bring it into your life, into family life, community life, and into public policy, then all the other things, they take on added value. Somehow we seem to be spinning our wheels in the mud when we try to, you know, tinker with public policy and leave spirituality out of it, and we tend to get nowhere. So as the experience in the United Nations, as Johnny was speaking about that, there we see, if you put in spirituality at the center of our activities, at a personal level and at the organizational level, at the community level, it's like a blessing to everything around. So I think that's the insight I would like to share with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swamiji. Let me ask Rabbi if he's still with us.
I'm with you.
Yes, please, Rabbi, a closing thought in a minute.
Yes, the basic struggle that goes on in the world is between the ethos of selfishness and the ethos of materialism, or looking out for number one on the one hand, and an ethos of caring for each other and caring for the planet. And we have to understand that no matter how much we develop ourselves internally, until we challenge the structures of domination and power that have subverted the best in religion, have taken over inside religions and made them simply be about self and not about other, and not about the world as a whole, we will never get a world that embodies the spiritual consciousness that is critical for the survival of our planet.
Brilliant, thank you. Rajiv?
Well, I'm really overwhelmed by so much wisdom that I feel hopelessly inadequate. But I do believe that without looking at method, I mean, we have lots of grand designs, and that's what the world should do, people should do, politics and religion, and we have wonderful ideas of the way the world should be. But I think the real challenge is the method. And the method has to start with the individual. And today, the individual is best accessed in the education system, and a university has to be a repository of reason and logic that circumscribes wisdom and transformation. So it is not about Buddhism or Vedanta or Judaism or any particular ism. And unless we go to the universal vocabulary, not merely of values, but of wisdom. So if today quantum theory is telling us that the very nature of reality depends on the observer, we have to work with that premise. And we have to recognize that reality itself is diverse. And so if we hold forth religiosity that says, no, reality is X, or we look at quantum theory to explain interdependence, or chaos theory really, which says that when a butterfly flaps its wings in the rainforest Amazon, there is something happening, there's a storm in Bangladesh. So we have to reconcile the reason and logic of modern science. That does not mean that that we are limited by reason and logic, because it cannot explain everything. So His Holiness will often say that unless reason and logic disproves something, like incarnation, for example, we will accept it. But if it disproves something, then we have to reject our beliefs. And the building blocks for young people today in any university worth its name is based on reason and logic. And we cannot romanticize a universal spirituality, because reality is in fact perceived differently by people. That old adage of an elephant and 9 blind men looking at the same element and seeing parts of it is now discounted by reason and logic and the methodology of science. Until science proves otherwise, I'm not making a case, and I will just end this, for an abject surrender to material science. But the wisdom of science, if we do not embrace that with our young people, I'm afraid we will not be able to reach out and affect the kind of global social transformation of values. Another very important point, I'm sorry I'm going on, is that we have to be very careful with our choice of words. Love today as opposed to compassion, or happiness as described by the American Constitution. For God's sake, I can't describe to you what coffee tastes like unless you've tasted it. Can I really even begin to use some sweeping phrases and try and use that to communicate? So without method, without experience, without transformation, without embracing the best of contemporary knowledge, I don't believe we'll make a breakthrough.
All right, I think you are suggesting to us that now we have the formula for making a breakthrough. We hear the ingredients. Thank you, Rajivji. Joni.
I think we've all been acculturated by the fluffy myth, and a university has to dare to move unapologetically beyond the prejudices around spirituality that we've all been acculturated with, and to really stake that ground boldly and clearly and without apology, without acceptance, without reliance on old paradigm understandings. I love Swamiji putting the one before the zeros. That's where it lives, whether we recognize that or not. So a university can go a long way to leading the transfiguration of our policies and practices, and the transfiguration of ourselves to accommodate that reality of where the one actually sits, and to create a new paradigm where the bottom line is love and spirit.
Thank you, Joni. And Mahmoud?
Thank you. Yes, my microphone?
Yeah, we're hearing you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Just want to say that in the context of right now.
Your video.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, thank you very much. I just want to say that at this condition right now, that is called unbridled capitalist situation or system, I think that the production of knowledge and research and ideas and thoughts and everything have become the means of power or the extension of power relations. As we can see I want to argue that in most of the universities in the West, at least, the mind of students and even colleagues and so on has somehow been captured by the capitalist requirements. I believe that in this situation, spirituality cannot have any voice, except if colleagues and professors try to somehow to change the assumptions and the foreknowledge of the students and themselves in order to open up a new horizon for understanding of how the Western spirituality can play an effective role in the real life of people.
Thank you so much. I will now ask one of our Tripp Fellows at the School of Government and Public Policy, who is also an academic tutor, Ms. Parinita Singh, who I will ask her. She has a deep interest in this subject matter as well, but her task today is just to say thanks to all of you who have engaged with us. So Parinita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks. I, on behalf of the founding members of the Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy, the Dean of Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, the Vice Chancellor, faculty, and students of Jindal Global University, wish to thank all of you for participating in today's discussion. Also, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our distinguished panelists, Swami Vivekananda, Rabbi Michael Lerner, Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra, Reverend Dr. Joni Kali, and Dr. Mahmood Masieli for your very insightful comments. And I wish to express our sincere thanks to all our participants. We hope you feel that it was time well spent. Also, a big thank you to all those who helped make this discussion successful, including our IT support. Once again, thank you all for your participation today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Parinita. And that brings us to an end. Again, really hearty appreciation to all of you. Thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.